The Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. Before I start today's contribution, I would like to express to the House and to the world in general my severe sadness at the passing of a very esteemed and revered colleague, doctor of mine, Dr Michael Mosley, and wish my very best and the condolences to his family and his loved ones. He has actually been responsible for a significant change in my own thinking when it comes to wellness, and I would think for many people in this chamber here. Now, moving on to the budget, I have to acknowledge the good works of the Honourable Rita Saffioti and wish her well, the continued. It has to be acknowledged this is a good budget. And there is a budget which reflects the standards of the current status quo thinking. But I'd like just to go on to say what is it about this budget which actually is good. Now, I have to bear in mind also that when I look at budgets, I also consider my own personal experiences. And looking at the budget of my own household, for example, I can look at what is going on in and out of the house. And I look at, for example, in my bathroom, the amount of containers and ointments and supplements on my wife's side of the basin, and look at my side. And I wonder what's the actual balance here when it comes to purchases for the house. My wife would make equally valid wonders about how I have actually spent what we have in a budget for the things which matter to me, like, for example, paying for a round of golf or indeed flowers for my wife. Now then, and the same is true of this budget here. So we have, if you like, the highlights of this. So there's the economic highlights, the financial management, and the investments and initiatives. And let's go through them just for a quick recap about the domestic economy growing at double the national rate. That's fantastic. And with a domestic economic growth forecast 5.25% for this coming year. Wonderful. Our exports are almost half of the nation's exports at $260 billion in this year to March, which is, again, I'll be referring to this later. The employment, of course, but here, look, 1.6 million in work, 300,000 jobs created. But on the other hand, we've also got to point out that I've never seen quite so many working poor as I have in these last few years. And this would reflect, I think, a state of how we are functioning as a state, which is a state of good wealth, but still we're finding a lot of people suffering, and that needs to be looked at in more detail. And again, not a word of criticism, because we're dealing here with difficult situations here, but we need to recognise this, and the budget as it's produced is highlighting what we find good, and the things which we need to work on are not actually highlighted, understandably so. These are things which, behind closed doors, people would think about. Population growth, for example, the biggest ever increase in WA's population. Now, you could say this is good for increasing our jobs, increasing our wealth, so manning the mine sites, for example. Yes, but 94,000 people also need a place to live, and that's a problem for us just now. And the inflation and wages. Now, we hear about the pressures easing, but just recently hearing about the Reserve Bank is considering, or at least not ruling out, the fact that rate increases may happen in the very near future. And that surely would cause great concern for the population, when you look especially at the mortgage stress that people are facing. In Gosnells, in my area, for example, there is, I think, no, in Byford, actually, 1 in 20 of the population there is having trouble meeting their mortgage payments. 1 in 20, which is a lot of people suffering, and every day coming back from work, wondering how they're going to put food on the table and pay for the house. There's a lot of stress in the society. The operating surplus here mentioned 3.2 billion. I do recall some years back 6 billion was mentioned, and the figures are actually within what was projected. But I'd also point out that the net forecasted debt of 28.6 billion, and it's said here it's almost 8 million lower than forecast, by all means. But it's also an increase in net debt over the last budget. And this needs to be looked at as well. How can we actually reduce the debt? Again, I look back to my own personal finances. If my wife is saying that the debt has gone up, I need to be looking at this very, very closely, because that is not something my wife would tolerate, and nor should she. We should be actually getting to debt zero. But having said that, we are doing very well as a state, in fact, probably the best in all of Australia. Now, looking at the investments and initiatives, and here we're looking at solutions, the cost of living relief, and mentioned that, the housing, what we're doing for the housing, I'll speak about this later, all very good things mentioned in the budget. The health, the $3.2 billion invested in the health and mental health system. excellent. I did point out a little while back that you have to do this. You cannot not increase the funds going into the health system, otherwise things go very bad very quickly. Education and training, 1.3 billion invested in education and training, and again, rightly so. This is here the future of our nation, of our state. And funding of new schools. The infrastructure is mentioned here, the 42.4 billion over the next 4 years of infrastructure. I'll come to that in a short while again as well. Also mentioned here was the economic diversification and decarbonisation with $1.8 billion to that. No one can quibble or should quibble with this. Regional investments, $4 billion in the royalties for regions. There's a lot being done for that major part of our society. And the environment and water security. Now here we're seeing environment and water security, 536 million invested. My point of view, and I'll mention this later, is we ought to be giving an awful lot more to our environment, because this really is where we're going to fall down in the future. And community support. Specifically mentioned here, family and domestic violence initiatives, child protection and mental health reforms. All of this is most welcome. And that's a summary, if you like, of the budget as it has been applied. Now, so I said initially, this is a good budget, and indeed it is a good budget as far as budgets go. It does, however, represent old thinking. Now, I looked at this 3 quite large volumes, and the first thing I noted when I got this hefty series of tomes in my hand is I don't have the staff to go through this with the detail that's needed. Now, that could be rectified. I mentioned this last year, and I believe the year before, that we don't really have enough staff to deal with the information coming through our doors. And it's been said we must pick our battles, and rightly so too, but the budget is very important. We just don't have the resources that we need to take this apart. So the budget reply I'm going to be giving you is limited to this extent, and I do ask for forgiveness on the part of that. Now, and if you're going to focus on the budget, we've got the question here of statewide issues, but also the question here that the state is part of a nation, and there's an interplay between the nation and the state, President, which needs to be reflected as well and finds its place in the budget. And beyond that, we've also got the questions here of our international relations, which affect the nation and then the state itself. In fact, we are going to welcome the Chinese President coming shortly, Prime Minister, I beg your pardon, and that is a wonderful thing about having our relations with our international partners in the area. And we need to work on that, because we in Western Australia are in fact intimately bound with Asia. And this must be reflected, especially in the Western Australian budget. Canberra, I've said this before, seems bound to the US. The AUKUS Treaty, I think, is one part. And of course, you have to say that this is the federal, the national budget, the national movement, but it seems rather remote to us here in Western Australia. You might as well be talking about a different country. And we need to be reflecting the fact that our situation in Western Australia needs to reflect more closely that of Asia, and not so much of our brethren across the water in the US. So these are going to have financial ramifications upon how we function in our state here. There's an increasing threat level, is there not, in the world these days? We've seen this right radical move in Europe, which seems to be spreading throughout the world. And the question is, how are we coping with that internationally and indeed nationally, with changes in mood, changes in behaviour in the world? How are we, in this current budget, how are we looking after ourselves here? We've got to address this and be clear to our electorate that we stand with them and that we serve the people, and we demand attention to facts, to science, not just to dogma that people might espouse. And this leads to some of the general concerns I have with what's going on with the current state of affairs between Parliament and the people. And a final aside on this, just before I begin my contribution here, the question here of the US relations, which ultimately have a knock-on effect here in Australia. And looking at what's happening just now, I cannot help but wonder, how bad can things get if the former guy happens to regain power in a place where we actually are so dependent upon working with our allies and I recall vividly when he first came to power, the first thing he did was cancel a major treaty that Australia was a part of, with a direct effect on our national budget, which then had an effect, of course, on our state budget as well. And you'd have to ask that if we're going to be led by people whose moral values are maybe less than we would expect in Australia, are we prepared to send our young people into armed conflict on behalf of a people whose moral values leave a lot to be desired? And these are questions which we, as a state, need to be involved in, because it is our children who will be heading off on behalf of our politicians. And we need to be very, very well aware that every life we put at risk is a treasured life. Just today, I was reading about the terrible emotions that the mother of Constable Woods, who died, of course, last year after being assaulted and stopped at a traffic offence, tried to stop the driver and was killed by that person driving the car. And the anguish of a mother losing a child. How can I sacrifice myself, she says. I would give anything to save my son. And all of us who are parents, especially those of us who have lost children, would immediately feel the pain of that situation and realise we must value every single life that we have in our society. Everyone here is of value. We cannot not do that. Now, moving on, let's look at the budget itself. Because I could go on about the state mentality, are we actually getting freedom in our society? How are we doing? We've got the police. We're looking here at how are we actually treating ourselves in a society where it seems to us that our personal freedoms are gradually being eroded. And are we comfortable with that? Are we financing organisations, institutions, which are leading then to a loss of our personal freedoms? This is a question that we as a community ought to be addressing, and not just looking at the bottom line, the line items of how much are we paying, but what is the effect of that on our society? And that is something which will be probably appearing in the media, in our chamber as well, and elsewhere, the conversations over a coffee or conversations over a beer. How are we actually doing? And I noticed the recent issues highlighted by the CCC, for example, the police who were involved some years back in supporting bikies in covering up a murder, which reminded me, of course, of that infamous episode back in the early 70s when a well-known madam from Perth was murdered, probably by police. The evidence seems to point there, but nothing was actually done about that. And this brings to my mind, at least, how are we certain that those who are given control or power over us actually merit the trust that we impose on them? And it's a very important question, and I'm not quite sure that the CCC actually does what we expect it to do, and we as a Parliament really ought to be looking to that in some stronger form. Because the police are so important to us, but as a society, I'm not certain that the police agree that we have got the right balance here. Where's the justice in our society? I'll speak to that in more detail later. Okay. So, one of the things that we can look at here is this fear of being under the total control of a state. This was not any more manifest than when the last Premier, the Honourable Mark McGowan, closed the borders and basically imposed upon us kind of a lockdown. Now, you can say that it was a very good thing to do because it prevented COVID from spreading, and we were all thankful that we were kept safe. On the other hand, and by the way, congratulations to the Premier on his high award, surely justly earned, but it does bring to mind the problem of are we actually using fear as a way of controlling the population rather than actually science? And this is an area where I think we need to be very, very careful, because the population demands of us that what we do is justified and that science backs us up, that the facts back it up, and not simply putting fear out there to control people, as so often happens. Now, in the budget, of course, we've got plenty of things which are valid of praise. One of them, of course, is the question about the housing, $1.1 billion in added funding. Now, anyone walking down St George's Terrace, as I often do on an early morning breakfast meeting, will encounter huddled shapes in doorways of those who are seeking shelter from the elements. There's a lot of them, and there's much more which is hidden. And also the children. Now, I see this as a general practitioner, of course. What are the effects of people whose housing is less secure? It affects our schooling, of course. It affects our mental health. And the future abilities, when you're under this extreme stress, your future abilities are coloured by your current experiences. And that then results in an altered approach to life down the track. And that has a transgenerational effect on wellness, physical and mental, and, of course, educational. Now, the teachers are crying out for help, and again, more on that later. But what we're seeing here is a cumulative effect of situations on the community resulting in less quality of life. And the valiant attempts from both sides of the House at various budgets and time to actually remedy this. Now, all praise must go to how do you balance the books and manage that. But the bottom line is that we're not actually succeeding that well. For a wealthy state, this actually is something that ought to be of major concern to us all. And we only need to speak about the construction sector and immigration to know that there are unanswered questions which are not answered in this budget either. Again, this year we had the $400 electricity rebate and a further $300 from the federal, which again is very welcome, because there's huge financial stress across our country, and it will help keep our homes warm this winter. So again, congratulations to the government for doing a very, very good job on that. But it's a temporary feel-good factor, is it not? Because it's like you're giving someone a fish, here's a fish to eat because you're hungry, we haven't taught them how to fish. So they're going to be hungry tomorrow or the day after. So these supplements we're giving people, when they are worn off, what do we have left? We've still got that day-to-day struggle to put food on the table. So it's going to have a minimal effect on inflation, but inflation, of course, just now is actually causing a problem, is it not? The RBA is certainly not averse to increasing our rates again, as I said earlier. Western Power, another area here. If you look at the power tariffs, they're increasing. I think the average increase in costs for the family is $6.61 on the monthly. It's not a great deal, is it? But it all adds up. It's certainly not getting any cheaper. And so, but I apologise if my figures are inaccurate. I don't have the facilities to do the proper deep down dig into the research, but that's the figures that I have obtained. And we could look at further increases, I'm sure, and it's eating into the benefits of what the government has given. So you're giving on the one hand and taking with the other. Now, if you're going to go on with that theme of giving with the one hand, look at the actual level of social housing that we have. Now, questions have been asked in this very chamber about that. So the new housing units, for example, you put out in the 2023-24 budget, 4,000 new social housing dwellings. Fantastic, with 1,200 already delivered. Okay? When you actually bear in mind the houses which have been removed because they were unfit for purpose or needed to be demolished, we've got a very small number. I think the number I had there was, 17, but it's probably more now. But it's certainly, when you look at this in balance, you're wondering, we've got the good points put out there, and quite understandably, the other side is not mentioned that well highlighted. We need to be aware of this for a balanced view of how we're actually doing, because we need to move forward. We need an ever-improving society, not one which is declining. Now, also the cost of providing food for a family of 4. I looked at last year. The cost was approximately an annual $7,000, almost $8,000. And 2024, the cost annually is around about $9,000, almost $10,000. Okay. So we've actually got an actual physical cost of living increase of about $1,000. I'm not sure that the wages have increased commensurate with that. And certainly when you look at the costs of the mortgages and the costs of food, we can see why this cost of living stress is putting so much pressure on people. And it has to be said that all parties are involved in recognising this is a major problem. And all parties are seeking solution, and I heartily welcome that. But we must be aware the situation is here on all sides of the House, because if we just try and paper it over and say how well we're doing, we're not actually giving as much effort as we can to actually fixing the underlying problem. And it opens us to attack from whichever side happens to be giving the opposing point of view. Neither of these behaviours is helpful to the people. We need honesty. We need a solution-oriented approach to managing this. Now, thinking of solutions, we've got the healthcare system here as well. Now, I've often spoken in this chamber about the healthcare system, but I've called it the sickness system rather than the healthcare system. And the reason for that Very simply, is because the current system of health at this moment in the country depends on diagnosing a disease, first of all. So we're actually focused on diagnosing something which has happened and then finding a fix for that. Now, what's happened, of course, is that the costs have increased, I wouldn't say exponentially, but they've regularly increased. But the benefits, as we get more and more progress with our health society, the benefits become progressively less and less. And as I've mentioned in this place before, what then happens is that the actual, as a business model, that must fail. I'll say it again. As a business model, what we currently have in place must fail. And this is a terrible situation to be in. It doesn't matter who is in power at the moment, this business model is not fit for purpose. And in our health system, I know personally, speaking to people who are involved at all levels of the health service, are saying this cannot go on. And yet, the only solution we find is to throw more money at the problem and hope it's going to get better. More buildings, more staff, more facilities. And what we need to be looking at is what is the underlying problem for the increase in demand. And we'll talk about that in a short while as well. But the 3.2 billion, I, of course, welcome that. It's absolutely important. Economic diversification, you've mentioned here, $1.8 billion devoted to the area. That's welcomed as well. What I'm looking for in the future is the topic of innovation, because without finding new ways forward, we're actually going to be doing more of the old. Now, as I was crafting this speech, I must say I've been working on this in my mind for the last month, and in my mind I've written it and rewritten it so many times, because there's such a lot that can be said. So I've only got a short time here, so let's come down to a more practical approach. And what would someone like myself suggest as a better way of managing our financial lifeblood? Because it's our financial lifeblood. We can all criticize, but the question is, what solutions bring us forward? What solutions can we find which, as a society, bring us into an ever-developing society? Because the question has to be asked. So someone asked me this a while back, why are you doing what you do? Why do you stand in Parliament? Why do you actually act? Why are you a member of that party? Explain that to me. And my answer is actually, well, we're doing this because we want to move towards a society where our children and grandchildren are better off than they are today. And I can't find anyone who would disagree with that. We are doing this to improve the well-being of our children and grandchildren in a better society. And that's a very noble cause. So the core of my reply is basically that we currently have $44.4 billion to fund all areas of government. That's about the sale price of Twitter. Now, if you look at the $44.4 billion operating budget, we've got a GDP here of $365 billion. Now, if you look at the Australian GDP for the whole of our nation, it's about 1.69 trillion of US dollars, and that puts us about 13th in the world economies. For a small nation of ourselves, 25 million, to be at 13th in the world is actually really, really well done. So no one can say that we're actually a poor nation. We're a very wealthy, a very rich nation. Are we behaving as such? Now, WA itself in that represents 17% of the GDP, so around about 2.5 trillion, $439 billion. And of that, 260 billion is exported. That's almost half of our exports, as I said before. So we're not a poor country, we're not a poor state. But as a nation, our GDP of almost $7 trillion ranks below New York and above Florida. So we are 13th in the world, but we're below the state of New York when it comes to our GDP. That puts it into some kind of context, where we are in the world. If you look at it, we've got $3.8 trillion in California, the number one state in the US, and 1.5 trillion in Florida. So there's ample room, is there not, for improvement in our state? Ample room. But to do that, to achieve the ample room for improvement, we need to do things differently. Let me say it again. Doing more of what we've done in the past will give us more of what we've achieved in the past. And if we're happy with that, fine. This budget here does that. What I would be putting out today is we need to think differently. And again, not a word of criticism at all, because we think the way we've always thought because it's comfortable doing that. But if we don't change our thinking, our behaviours stay the same. And if our behaviours stay the same, the outcome is the same. I'll be happy with the outcome. And clearly, if you ask the people say no. And we, representing the people, must therefore think differently, act differently, suggest different approaches. The needs of the people come first. So, if the needs of the people are that we're going to get a better society for our children and grandchildren, define better. What does better actually look like? What does it mean? Does it mean more laws? Should we create more laws to keep us safe, to keep us within our bounds? Because is that a false safety? I spoke earlier about the efforts to save us in COVID, and how borders were closed and we were limited, much worse in Victoria, of course, but here we were restricted as well. The people couldn't travel in and out, and yes, COVID was kept away from us, but were we actually safer? Did we actually suffer more? Did our economy implode a bit? Did mental health suffer greatly? It did. So do we actually get better with more laws? A short while ago, in this very chamber, I put the question, over the last 30 years, all the laws that we have created here, are we any better for them? Are we safer? Are we happier? And the answer is that after 30 years of consequent law-making, we're not better off, we're not happier, and we certainly don't feel safer. I would challenge anyone to say we feel safer than 30 years ago. What about freedom? What is freedom? The freedom I would define is to be free to do what I want, when I want, how I want. You may call that anarchy, and I would agree, because there's a proviso in that. I want to do what I want, when I want, how I want, provided no one else gets hurt. This is a definition of freedom I think we can all agree with. Now, that is probably the opposite, I think, of giving more laws, when we're actually more restricted. It's a lovely joke I think I might tell just now, if I have a moment, about the definition of laws. In France, for example, everything is allowed except that which is expressly forbidden. In Germany, I lived many years in Germany, everything is forbidden except that which is expressly allowed. In Italy, I'm told, I have not lived there, everything is allowed, including that which is expressly forbidden. And in Russia, where I have lived, everything is forbidden, including that which is expressly allowed. And I have experienced that personally. Trying to take a photograph at a railway station in the Soviet Union was expressly forbidden, although it was expressly allowed. Okay, so what is freedom? To say what I want, when I want, how I want? Then others get offended. But here we've got the question is, are we allowing ourselves to be offended? Or should we actually just should we actually just allow other people to express themselves and I don't have to take offence at your opinion? Because, to be honest, your opinion doesn't really matter. What you say, do or think doesn't really matter. As long as it's not hateful, as long as it's not hurtful or harmful, your opinion is not my problem. Your opinion is not my problem. And so I should not then easily take offence at what other people say, do or think, but I can engage with them. Is that freedom? These are the questions that we must discuss among ourselves at this level, because we are the ones who will be giving the law to the people. Maybe we should go back to what I originally said, again, in this chamber some time back. What is the overarching law that we ought to be supporting here? Of all the laws, the first and most important law is to be kind to each other. Practice kindness. If we have kindness, then we don't really need much more in the way of laws. The law to stop you from stealing doesn't matter if you're taking someone's iPhone or if you're taking $10 billion from someone else's account. Be kind. Don't do these things. If you've got something to say to someone and it's going to be hurtful, be kind. You don't have to say that. You can be forgiving. You can be understanding. You don't have to say what you think about someone. Just like my mother said, if you can't find anything good to say about someone, don't say anything at all. But if you do happen to make an opinion that I don't have to take offence, I can say, I hear what you're saying. Doesn't trouble me at all. Your opinion doesn't matter. So there are three areas which need to be addressed for a progressive society where kindness features. And that is the first area is agriculture, then education, then wellness. Those three areas, those core areas of activity, without which we would suffer. Agriculture to create the food we need to survive. Education to teach us how to grow the food we need. And wellness to allow us to enjoy the benefits of the food we're eating and the society we live in. Now, I'm going to be talking specifically about a number of areas that I think are of importance, at least to me, and I hope to you as well. One, of course, is the sickness department. One is the education in our state. One is about law and order. But, let's not speak about law and order. Let's speak about justice. Because we've got plenty of laws, we've got plenty of commands for order, but we don't really have justice in our state. And the last one here, and probably the most important just now, is environmental issues, agriculture and the environment. Yes, climate change, but also the opportunities that arise in dealing with the challenge of climate change. So it leads to one very important question, looking at this list of things that I would recommend as being important for how we manage our society. The question here is, does our current system have the ability, or even the interest, in making significant changes? Does our current system have the ability or the interest in making significant changes? Let's start with health. Are we healthier than we were 30 years ago? Well, life expectancy in 1994 and 2024. In 1994, life expectancy for males was about 75, and for females, 81. Life expectancy now for males is 81 and females 85. So male has increased from 75 to 81 and females 81 to 85. Great. Except, since 2011, there's been a slight decrease in longevity worldwide, not just in Australia. So it appears that what we're doing now is not actually increasing our longevity or indeed quality of life, it's actually beginning to pull back. So something is going wrong somewhere in our health system. Mental health has been particularly negatively impacted. At the moment, we've got in Australia 8 or 9 suicides a day. It's 8.6 on average. 8 or 9 suicides a day. In this great country of wealth, a great country where we can live comfortably, mental health is a major problem. 20% of the population suffers from some form of mental disorder. But young adults now have about 39% of mental health disorder. And of those young adults, young women have about 46% of mental issues. 46%, almost half of young females have some form of mental stress disorder. Now, the University of Queensland School of Public Health estimate, Australia-wide, that the cost of mental illness and suicide in Australia is close to $180 billion annually. $180 billion is the cost to our community of failing to address serious mental health issues. Proportionately, that would mean that we in WA need to devote $36 billion to mental health. Or we could devote a substantially lesser amount to the root causes of mental health disorder. At the moment, we've only got, $1 billion for mental health? And the research suggests that the overall benefit to the community, to the economy, for treating mental health, for every dollar spent, you get $3 back in return. So it actually makes good financial sense to have adequate mental care to return people to normality, to return people into a state of mental well-being. You're going to get 3-to-1 return on your dollar. That's spectacular. We've only got 325 psychiatrists registered in WA and 3,000 psychologists, about 10% are psychiatrists. And I still can't get a patient to see a psychiatrist in less than 18 months, 2 years. Unless, of course, it's an emergency off to the ED, which is a spectacularly wrong place to send a mentally ill person. Let's look now at chronic disease. And we're finding here, with chronic disease, in our progressive society, that there's a heavy toll on our community. Now, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reports that in last year, 2023, in Australia, we lost 5.6 million years of healthy life due to chronic disease. This is not acceptable. That's both fatal and non-fatal impacts. Non-fatal burden, that's living with illness injury, is just over one half of the total burden. That's a lot of people are attending the general practice and our specialist sites to manage their chronic disease problems. And the cost, I haven't got the figures here, but the ABC 730 programme noted that it costs billions of dollars annually, with a significant portion of these costs, hear this now, a significant portion of these costs are preventable through better management and prevention strategies. Significant proportion are preventable. Now, again, if we look at the cost in 1994 and compare to 2024, the cost has escalated. The costs associated with managing a chronic disease, including direct health expenditures, and indirect cost, this is lost productivity, you can't get to work or you can't work as well, suggests the economic impact now runs into billions of dollars annually, and it's a dramatic increase over the last decades. Now, let's look at one aspect of this. If the significant costs are preventable, what are the preventable costs that we are not addressing, and why not? Why are we not addressing the costs of preventing chronic disease? I see nothing in the budget papers about that. Health Department, nothing at all. Is this because we're doing more of what worked in the past and expecting a different outcome? It's the Einsteinian definition of madness. Now, things move on. The medical practice moves on. I qualified many years ago. If I, right now, were to practice the medicine I was practicing when I first qualified, to the same standard of a well-qualified medical practitioner then, if I continued practicing that same medicine, I would now be struck off for incompetence. Medical world has changed radically. So that means we've got to innovate and move with the times. Doing more of what happened in the past isn't sufficient in our sickness system. It's not magic. Now, what are the biggest causes of chronic health disease? What are the biggest causes? Well, you can guess. The first one is lifestyle choices. What are those? Tobacco, alcohol, lack of exercise. Those are lifestyle choices. Another really important area is poor nutrition and obesity. In 1995, 57% of Australians were obese or overweight. Now it's something like 68%, 69%. So we've increased our obesity over the 30 years, which means that we've got more hypertension, we've got more cardiovascular disease. Things have improved. We haven't got as many deaths due to smoking. That's reduced a lot. But we have these problems. Mental health is another area of major problems. Sleep disorders. And we've got the effects on mental health of our connected environment, our internet, the apps we're using, and the lack of sleep because of that. And indeed, the mind going around when you're clicking on these points here, looking for that dopamine fix in your brain as you find another click on your system there. So we need to address this. But there is one area I really want to address when it comes to managing preventable chronic health disease, and that is the gut health.
Michael Mosley.
Now, you might think, yes, I gave my condolences to Michael Mosley's family at the beginning. Most of our chronic disease, I think, in my experience, in the practice, and agreed with my patients, by the way, is actually due to the gut health. Now, most people think the gut is a deeply unsexy place where poo is made. It's actually a fantastic, if you open up the gut to its maximum area, it occupies a space of, can you guess it? It's a tennis court. The gut occupies the space of a tennis court. Each part of that is intensely active biochemically, immunologically. It's a wonderful organ. It transfers the outside into inside, transforms our wellness. And the primary cause of the failure of that organ is actually the food processing industry. We go now into the shops just now, and we are getting food-like foods. Our great-grandparents wouldn't recognise what we're shopping for. A Country Women's Association cookbook 1955 is very different from what we get in the supermarkets now, and the way it's prepared. And you look at the wellness of the people in those days who were working harder on the land, eating the foods that were actually in that cookbook, that almost 70-year-old cookbook, that is what we would probably be better eating than getting your packets just now, high sugar content, chemicals. In fact, if I could give a word of advice to people, is that if you see the green tick of health on that, avoid that because it's been chemically altered. That is not healthy. It may have the green tick of health, that's written by people who know nothing about nutrition. And are we going to address the food processing industry? Well, on which planet are you living? The food processing industry is actually a major employer, a major source of revenue, and there's no way that this country just now is going to be affecting what the food processing industries do. It just is not possible. It's got significant impacts on our public health. They affect the microbiome, the chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease. And because of the poor management of these issues, we're seeing a whole host of issues. And I can, every day in my clinic when I'm there, I can show you example after example after example of cases where the gut is primarily affected. Just the other day there, I was dealing with someone who came with the thyroid. And when I asked questions, that the gut is a problem. Beyond that, the hormones were a problem caused by the gut. And beyond that was the adrenal gland was a problem caused, again, by the gut and the lifestyle there. So there's a huge cycle there of chronic ill health, affecting cortisol, affecting estrogen, affecting the mental health. And how do you fix that? How do you fix a society where it's normal to eat food which is making you sick? There's something else we could look at as well, and in the health system, the costs that are lost in our health system due to waste. Now, in the book, in the budget paper, I saw some mention made about the approach to managing waste and inefficiencies, resource allocation and operational inefficiencies, and digital health initiatives and workforce improvements. If you speak to any health professional working in a hospital, for example, they point out instance after instance of areas where there has been massive loss, waste, poor planning, poor management, where our resources are just, it's like you've got the sink open, the drain is open, and the water that you want to drink is pouring away into the ground. It's lost to us. Money that we could spend on managing our health service better is being thrown into the waste because we're not caring for it enough. And there's not much done here in this budget paper to address that. And that should be. So the solutions I'd put forward is we must look at this more closely. We must, because this is the lifeblood of our economy. The lifeblood of our people is how we look after the wellness. And if we can't afford the wellness because we're throwing the money away, we're suffering second-class medicine. This is not acceptable. So I'm sure the government is going to be looking at that in future, and good luck to them as well, because this is essential. We must do this. I'll move on now to education. Now, I was speaking the other day with a friend of mine who grew up in Singapore, and who noted on arriving in Australia that in the same class group he was 2 years ahead of his classmates when it came to all aspects of schooling. Are we happy with this? If you look at Shanghai, for example, which is a Chinese major city, and look at the qualities of those who are English-speaking and have learned that, they've actually got better English capabilities than a lot of our university entrants. Now, think about it. Chinese is not at all similar to English, and yet people are being produced in a society where English is not that well spoken as a second language, but those who do learn it are able to speak and write and understand better English than those who grew up here as English speakers and have gone to university and are found not to be capable of writing a comparable essay. And then you look at how our teachers are being managed. I vividly recall in my school days, my early days, the teachers as being one step short of God. Apart from the fact that they had canes or straps to punish us with, they also were the font of all wisdom, and our parents would listen to what they said, and if we didn't do what we should have done, the parents gave us trouble as well as the teacher. Now, a teacher these days will earn between $70,000 and $100,000 a year. And you might say, well, that's a lot of money, it's good enough. But I was looking just recently at lollipop traffic controllers who get between $80,000 and $120,000 on average. But they can get up to $200,000 or over. So can you imagine you're a teacher here and you're educating the future of our nation and you're getting less than someone who holds a lollipop on a building site? Now, I listened to the arguments of those wielding the lollipops who are saying it's a risk environment, you need a lot of preparedness to deal with unknown situations. Absolutely, yes, you do. Teachers any less? I mean, there's a teacher being assaulted every 40 minutes at the moment. Is that not a risk environment? They're being bombarded with emails after hours by parents who are demanding and turning up in violent mood during the day. Is that not a risk? So 13,000 assaults a year. Head teachers, I think 60% have been assaulted by a parent or a student in a year. And at the moment, we've got 700 vacancies, probably more, 700. And I wonder why. Could it be that teachers aren't as respected as they were before? Could it be that teachers aren't being remunerated as well? Could it be that the system that they're operating isn't teaching as effectively because we're following fads? How do you, for example, just recently we learned about how people are learning how to read in newer ways which aren't as effective as the old ways of learning how to read. I look at my children, for example, with their writing. They have got not the first clue about cursive writing. Not the first clue. So using a pen and paper, or indeed a pencil and paper, is foreign to them. It's his keyboard, and the handwriting is terrible. Now write an essay using the childlike primary school handwriting. We failed. We have failed. And if you look at in my clinic again, and I speak with teachers quite a lot, because they do suffer quite a lot of health because they're being under so much pressure. Stress is a major problem for the teachers, and they're resigning, and they're attending with work cover for injuries sustained. And then we're finding, I am finding, that the support that they have at the education system within the school and beyond in the department is often unsupportive. So they're actually having to struggle for their own benefit against the system, which seems to be loaded against them. Is this the right way to teach those who are actually guiding our children into the future and who, in a few short years, will be looking after us as we get old? Is that any way of treating them? And then you look at the curriculum, and we look at the fads which have come and gone with the curriculum, and it seems to be that the system we are operating under, and I've asked teachers about this, and they agree with me, the system that we are operating is still based on that 19th century model of teaching people just enough to be able to work in the mills and so that be the 95% employees of the big mill owner. Rote learning, deficient essay skills, and the university standards. And I've got a son who's just come back today from his first term at university. How have you managed with that? Well, better than the others because he went through a different system. But man, the young people are struggling now to actually keep up with that high level of education. So I don't think we're preparing our children well. And the teachers I've spoken to would agree with me on that. And I'm actually having a meeting in the short term with people who are actually looking at how can we better improve this. And this is something I'm sure the government is taking care of because they must be well aware of this. I would like to see this reflected in the budget papers because we depend upon the teaching and the schools to produce the high level of young people into a society because they are our future. So I do think that we've got I wouldn't say a failing school system, but it certainly is having a hard time just now. Bear in mind, I've actually had experience in a number of countries. I've experienced schools and children in schools in the UK, in Germany, in Russia, China, Hong Kong, as well as Australia. So I've had a look across the spectrum as to what's available. And while Australia is not doing too badly, it's also not excelling. It's not excelling. We have the abilities, we have the funds, we have the society which allows with the richness to educate people, and we're not doing it. I don't know why we're not doing it. Look at the USA, for example, and look at the education standards of the students there. Some of them are actually brilliant. They land on the moon, for goodness sakes. But others wouldn't know where Australia is on a map. How about critical thinking? The ability to differentiate between truth and falsehood. The ability to look at questions from both points of view to come to a balanced opinion. That is a critical thinking skill which I think is not actually being followed. What solutions would I see? Well, it's something we ought to be funding more. Listen, replace the curriculum, but not with pseudoscience and dogma. Let the experts lead the discussion, not the politicians, not the influencers. Permit more attention to our neurodevelopmental issues. So the children who just know, especially with minor autistic spectrum disorders, is it a disorder, or are they simply better able to cope with the electronic environment? Let's find out, because the first question I ask of parents who come to me with an autistic child is, what is your child's gift? And very often they've got magnificent, magical gifts, which we need to take note of and encourage, because putting them all into one class and making them all follow the same regime and sit down and be quiet just doesn't work these days. We need to allow them to flourish, to discover their way, to explore, to look at the heavens and see the Galilean moons around Jupiter. We need them to be able to dig into the earth and see what the soil is doing and how the worms are flourishing. We need them to actually be exploring this world with curiosity, not learning how to do things in a school system where they pass the exam and they may succeed or not. It's like asking an elephant to climb a tree. The monkey can do it better, the monkey is the best. No, we've got different abilities, different skills, and we need to encourage our children. We need a new way of thinking. I mentioned this new thinking, a new way of thinking in our society. It's absolutely essential. And the one area which I really want to focus on is the art of communication, because this affects not only education, but also mental health. A lot of our problems in society are inherently due to our inability to communicate. Now, you might ask, what on earth is Walker talking about? The superficial communication that we have represents about 7% of our communication. And most of us are communicating even less than 7%. We're communicating superficial things. What was on television last night? What was the footy score? The actual communication about, hey, how are you? Tell me more. Okay, let's sit down and let's have a listen. We haven't got the time for that. We're not communicating one with the other in a supportive manner. We're not actually listening to people. I get my patients saying to me quite a lot, and that's really quite depressing actually, you're the first doctor who's listened to me. Now that's because I've learned how to communicate, but it also reflects that our communication skills as a society are kind of lacking. We communicate these days as if we're fighting. We're behind a barrier here. We get up, we fire bow and arrow at someone with our point of view, and we duck behind the parapet. And someone gets up there with their bow and arrow and fires their thoughts back. We duck. And we're hoping to get a hit. My point of view wins, there we are. A bit like the electoral system, actually. What we should be doing is saying, the walls come down, you've got a different point of view than I do, let's hear what you've got to say. I want to understand what you've actually said. And you need to understand what I've actually said. Perhaps we'll find more in common than we thought before. And then the pressure, the stress, the discordance in society can ease. Would that be a help for mental health? At work, for example, if you've got a psychopathic boss who's actually giving you a whole host of trouble, and look, we've come across this so many times, of people who are from above there, they're imposing their will and they're bullying people. But the psychopath actually up there, they're kind of sucking up their employers, and they're the best people there. And they get promoted because they're very good at communicating how good I am to the ones up there. But the ones down below, they're giving a really hard time to. We all know these people. How do we deal with that? We need to learn how to deal with that kind of person. And there's ways of learning how to do that so that we'd actually not suffer as much at work. And that's a communication skill. Now, the problem with that is, if you start learning at 4, which is a good time to start learning how to communicate, who teaches the teachers to communicate? Because they haven't learned either. So they're going to have to struggle to find out how best to communicate in a way which is supportive. So the whole concept of communication has to be rethought and practiced. We need to redesign our schools, not just the Montessori approach, but we need to rethink, what does education actually mean? Does it mean learning things by rote? Or does it mean using what we've got in technology to allow you to think further, to think better, to think deeper, to actually explore things? We can use the AI, for example, to answer the simple questions. When was the Battle of Hastings fought? I can ask that there. Do I need to remember that? What I need to remember is what actually caused that discordance in the first place. So new thinking is needed there as well. Let's move on now to another area of great passion of mine, law and order. Now, I've said before in this chamber that we and the Legalise Cannabis Party appear to be the party of law and order because we stand up here for what is just in society. We've got laws, but how much justice is there? Now, I'll give you an example of this. My driving. I'm not a bad driver, but there's one time I was coming home from Serpentine on a strange road. It was dark, there's no lighting. I wasn't aware of the road, but the stock road going down is dual highway, and it's separated by quite a large area of land. I was turning right, And I turned right and I noticed, oh my God, I'm turning into the left-hand lane. It was dark and I couldn't see what's going on. Oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. So I went onto the middle of the road and thought, well, that was okay, sorted that one out. So worked out what was going on, got the right time, turned onto the road properly, went back. Of course, the police had seen me and came after me and said, first thing they did was stop the car, of course, let's do a breath test. Alcohol was 0. You'd expect that of a doctor. Alcohol was 0. You might think, they said, well, what happened? I said, well, I missed the road. I'm not familiar with the road. There's a problem there, sorted it. And it was very quickly, very professionally dealt with. Back on the road. What did the police do? They fined me. Rather than saying, well done, you notice it and you fixed it quickly. That's very professional, very appropriate. No. You've broken the law. We'll fine you for that. So, yeah, it was legal. It was the law. That's the way it was. Was it just? I would put it to you, no. There's no recognition of the safety aspect, no recognition of the rapidity and the safety of managing that difficult situation. What about more major issues? Punishment, prison. There, the prisoner has been in there for 9 months and he's got drug problems, he's got a professional burglar, and he's in prison there, no real help at all. There's the front door, you've done your time, out you go, the door slams behind you, you've got your money you came in with, you've got your medication in a pack, off you go. Have we served that person well? No. He's been punished, but has he been rehabilitated? No, he has not. Is he likely to commit crime again? Yes, he absolutely is. What do our figures show? Huge amounts of recidivism. And we're comfortable with that. Do you know what the costs to our society are for that? They're massive. Well, again, multi-billion-dollar costs. And we're not fixing that because we don't really care about that, do we? Because if we did care about that, we'd have fixed that by now, and we haven't. How about domestic violence? The accused, in there, released. The police had expressed concern, but no, out you go. The magistrate said, you're fine, out you go. And just last week, the friend saying, he almost killed that woman, and you're letting him out with a restraining order. Don't approach this woman. Huh? Is that justice? Are we getting justice in our society? I recall vividly some years ago when I was working in the corrective services, a man did just that. He was released, went to his ex-wife's home, killed her with a knife, and felt, yeah, honour is satisfied, I've killed her, she shouldn't have been like that, and now he went back to prison with a smile on his face, Where was the justice in that? Is that being repeated on a regular basis? It certainly is. Will it happen again? Yes, it will, because we haven't learned to combine the punishment side with justice. There's multiple stories of concerns by the legal fraternity regarding the improper behaviour within the judicial system. And one area where I desperately want to make a change is getting the judicial review body so that we can actually challenge the courts and the judges as to the decisions they make, because they do make improper decisions. Absolutely they do. And does anyone have any oversight? No. So they are free to carry on making their dubious decisions, and no one holds them accountable. Now, I know the government here plans to make changes there, but man, it's taking a long time. What's the cost to our community? Well, people are suffering, actually, because of that. People are actually incarcerated, or indeed people are let free who shouldn't be. In my personal experience, I had a patient of mine who, self-litigating, but she was badly treated by the family court. And the multiple cases of improper management of the documents, improper, even in this case, the magistrate, the judge, made a medical diagnosis. Because the diagnosis was made, this is what we've got here, by a qualified doctor. And the judge said, no, this here is a clear case of so-and-so, made a diagnosis, and then punished the patient because of the diagnosis that person had made. Now, anyone else, you'd be reported to APRA for making a medical decision without qualification. That's actually punishable by fines, maybe even imprisonment. But the judge had no such limits. Made a medical decision in the full view of the court, and nothing was done to rectify that. So to whom can the judiciary be referred if there's no provision for that to happen in the first place? We don't have a system there which allows for that. We've also got lies enshrined in law. Now, I'm referring here, of course, to the THC driving law. Now, you all know my point of view on this. I won't bore you with it too much. But the point that I'm making here is that we all know that the presence of THC does not indicate impairment. Just the level of THC has no relationship whatsoever to the level of impairment. But still, the law says if it's positive, you must be impaired. That's a lie. It's actually a physical lie. And 10 months on from the government saying, yes, we're going to create a body to review this and change the law, nothing. They haven't even appointed anyone. Are we comfortable with the lie being enshrined in the law? Apparently, yes. So now innocent people, I came across a case just last week, are now being required to stand in front of a magistrate to defend themselves for driving with medical cannabis on board, are completely unimpaired, but now they're faced with the potential of being banned from entry into the US for holiday because they're now declared to be drug driving. Where is the justice? Does anyone actually care? Apparently not. Another clear case is the criminal confiscation laws. Now, the Honourable Wayne Martin gave his report in 2019 and very clearly said that this is where one's property can be removed if someone else, even without your knowledge, has committed a crime. For example, if I happen to be doing a drug deal in Kings Park, you could possibly say, we'll now take the value of Kings Park as the place we did business, and that's the substitute where we're going to fine you that amount for the value of Kings Park for having committed your crimes in Kings Park. That is the way the law is created now. And 5 years on, we still have had no action at all. Does anybody care? And again, rather, I suspect not. This year, the justice system didn't merit actually a comment, and it's on the budget statement. And we've got no major progress in Banksia Hill. Work is being done, yes, but where's the progress? And the issue with that, of course, is that those young people who are being incarcerated, what's the actual problem? What's the underlying problem? Well, it's psychosocial. It's not to do with bad behaviour, it's to do with the way they actually were brought up. If you're actually in the mother's womb and the mother is actually drinking lots of alcohol, your brain is not going to be right. There's damage there. You then grow up sniffing glue, associating with people who do bad things. You're going to regard that as normal. You now commit crime, and people say you shouldn't be doing that, but everyone else is doing that, so I'm going to carry on doing it. I know nothing else. And so this progresses and progresses and progresses until you end up in Banksia Hill. And then you get sent on to Casuarina. And the whole thing raises the furore in the public, and we're all saying how bad this is. Are we dealing with the underlying problem? And the answer is no. Can we expect an improvement? The answer is no. How much is it costing us as a society? Has anyone actually calculated how much it costs not to deal with this problem? Are we happy with this? Have we got enough money that we can just chuck the money away, just keep things going? As long as I'm not in prison, I don't care. And then substance abuse, alcohol in the first place. And we're quite happy just to let people buy alcohol, indeed steal alcohol. And the risks of psychosis, the risks of major mental health problems, the risks of very deleterious behaviour, all of that is likely with the simple use of a commonly used drug. Okay. But still, people are saying, well, cannabis is bad. No, it's not. It's not. That's far safer than alcohol and tobacco, and still we're saying, that's bad. What's going on with that? How can we actually continue propagating lies and expect to get away with it? So the situation is intolerable. Mental health and corrective services. We all know that corrective services are holding cells for mental hospitals who are overloaded. Dedicated people are trying to work on that. Dedicated people. The costs to the community can be measured in the millions, if not the billions of dollars. And again, we're not fixing it. Now, the mental health advocates are telling us not enough is being done. And it's not, plainly not. And look at the teenagers, the recent tragic case of a teenager killing himself in the cell. These are predictable, and it will happen again. And it will happen again until we deal with the fundamental underlying cause. And the Chief Justice of the State has concluded, our laws are inherently flawed and not fit for purpose. This is the place where laws are made. Our laws are inherently flawed and not fit for purpose. Are we comfortable with that? And again, the answer is probably yes. So this is one area where we might actually have some improvement in the budget. Now, Legalise Cannabis in WA, we would suggest proper mental health funding and proper nursing care. In fact, we're thinking about how do we manage actually the mental health of our police officers, who are suffering tremendously. High rates of suicide, high rates of PTSD. Are we treating our police officers well? I think probably we could treat them an awful lot better. Do you not? Now, we move on to environment and agriculture. I said earlier that if you look at the overall trends, we've got grains. Our grain production is about 10.1 billion this coming year. Livestock, 14.7 billion. Horticulture, 17.4 billion. Wool and dairy, 2.9 to 5 and 6 for the dairy. Canola, 3.6 billion, and other crops like that. This is not small change. So the current value of our agricultural sector is about 15 to 20 billion dollars. And we've got important things to deal with here: our trade agreements, our commodity prices internationally, estimates. And we're going along as if things are just going to carry on the way they have been. We haven't addressed the salination, the change of the soil, the broad acreage farming we've got there, all of them with their inherent products, results, which give less yield. I mean, 3-bag yield just now compared to 8 bags in New South Wales. It reflects our poor soil. What can we do about that? Well, we've also got warming. Noticing now the trees which are dying, the plants which are vanishing, the loss of the diversity of our animals. Reduced rainfall, it's evident, reduced rainfall. I mean, not just now, perhaps, but over a year, we're seeing reduced rainfall. And what about the available water we've got? I mean, apart from giving it free to be sold by Coca-Cola, what are we actually doing for that? I mean, we've relied upon groundwater quite a lot. Declining rainfall over the last decades has significantly reduced groundwater recharge rates, I'm told. Desalination and recycling, so we've got about half of our drinking water comes from desalination. We can go on. Look, and the government, to be fair, is doing a lot to remedy this. But what about if we decide to stop wasting water? What about if we decided that we should drink the water rather than pooing in it? Wouldn't that be a good choice? How much do we actually lose because of the way we waste our water? I'll come to that in a moment again, but the environment affecting farming communities, economic turmoil, the farm gate prices, the yield, the social issues, how do you manage in a society where the small towns are actually dying, where the schooling is failing, where the childcare is not available. We need to look and revisit how we're caring for all in our society in all areas. Because at the moment we're farming, and we have, it must be said, scientifically the best farmers in the world, I would think. I'm sure that Orla Modan and West would agree. We have got fantastic farmers here. But we're still using Northern European type farming to manage our situation here. This needs a rethink, a broader community rethink. This is our food supply, not just our food, but also the quality of our food, the chemicals affecting our health, and the ecology which is being supported, the insects, the bees, and the quality of life with our available nature. And what about national security? If we're selling our farms, the ones which are being given up, to Chinese purchasers for their super funds, are we actually looking after our country for ourselves, or are we actually beholden to a foreign power? Does the US own us? How secure are we when it comes to actually food sustainability? How secure are we if things should go pear-shaped? And are we selling stuff too cheaply? I mean, what about the free gas we're giving away, no royalties? What about buying back our own steel? We're exporting our ore, and we're not making us have to buy back the steel. Yes, it's cheaper made abroad there. Are we mad? No royalties for gas? Are we mad? And the same issue is with the free water, which is now being sold back to us. That's changed now, but 30 years that's been going on. So how could we save water? This goes on to my thought here about actually the environment and energy. You all know, I'm sure, about biodigesters. Now, if we were to use third world technology, we're talking here about stuff which has been going on for 70 years in China, the third world technology for biodigesters providing power to the remote areas of China. There's an acquaintance of mine in the UK, ex-nuclear physicist, who has built, 1990-something, a complete sewage department, a sewage farm, which turned sewage into gas, which powered electricity. That's pretty much first world technology, which is available here as well. There's a group in the southwest which would be very interested in looking at developing biodigesters for our use. Now imagine, let me just paint a picture for you, if you will. Let's imagine a small town, say 250 souls, and let's put a biodigester which takes the household waste, maybe even animal waste, and turns that into methanol or ethanol, depending on the process. Let's put that in the centre of the facility. Let's get people employed at looking after that. And the electricity then generated with the gas, the methanol or the ethanol drives the turbine, which generates electricity. So now imagine when the power in Perth falls out due to, say, a storm, this actually in the wheatbelt town, wherever it's going to be, has its power still. So you don't have to ditch the contents of your freezer because the freezer has switched off. You can keep that going. If you add onto that the solar housing, solar power on top of the houses, and maybe even if you wanted some wind power in your backyard for a small level, you'd be getting actually pretty good sources of electricity, especially adding in a battery to all that. And you can get batteries now for reasonable prices, 1/5 the cost of a Tesla, I am told, Tesla battery. And now we've got actually a sustainable environment generating your own electricity within a small town in the regional and remote areas, which is not dependent upon power lines from outside, not dependent upon power generated elsewhere, looking after it yourself. Is that not a good idea to trial? Should we not bring that into our thinking? Would that not be better than simply saying, Western Power, please supply, and we'll pick up the pieces when they fall? Let's think differently. So the advanced biodigesters, and then, of course, the byproduct is actually burnable bricks for heating in the winter, or indeed a sensible fertiliser for the soil. It's water sparing, so we're not actually pooing in our drinking water, we're not having deep septic tanks. And the environmental impact is fantastic. We reduce the greenhouse emissions, we're capturing the methane, and we're turning that into organic waste. Oh dear. What else would we do? We'd save sewage, create electricity, and protect the environment. I'd also at this point suggest, well, perhaps we ought to think about hemp. Now, I know you've all been waiting for this. But if we were to actually use hemp as a product, we'd actually be having the biomass for the biodigesters. And you'd protect the water going into the river systems, because they're collecting it, and you turn the topsoil from 10 centimetres into 1.5 metres of topsoil with a good microbiome, which would then increase your yield, hopefully from 3 to 8 bags. But depending on what you've got there's a whole host of options for what you could grow in areas where the soil is fantastic. Add hemp to the wheat and sheep mix that the farmers want for the security. Make it to 3 things that the farms could grow, especially in rotation crop. Would that help? Yes, it would actually. I'll come to that in a moment again. Because hope, you see, lies in innovation, innovative ideas. Now, again, looking at the wastage here, I remember one time I was involved in getting an X-ray facility in a government institution. And we had to tick all the boxes, and it was corrected again because the things we chose were a bit too expensive, so they made different choices, but the boxes were ticked. So the X-ray machine was set up, and then the radiologist refused licensing because it was the room facility was too small. $750,000, $750,000 went down the tubes, and no one was held accountable because the right boxes were ticked. I'm wondering just now, we've got Metronet just now with $2 billion initially, $2 billion in 2017, $12.4 billion now. It's going to be welcome infrastructure for sure, but there's a $10 billion overspend there. Had the government applied the same rules to themselves as they applied to the housing, the construction companies, that would be bankrupt. Because the housing companies, the construction companies, weren't allowed to increase their prices depending on their suppliers. They weren't. And therefore, there's a huge problem now in actually completing housing appropriately. So we've now got problems in our housing department because of the laws that you have applied, but you don't apply it yourself. And that $10 billion extra, could that have been spent on health, education, justice, environment? Is that trade-off acceptable? Well, it's going to be a quality decision. You complained on this side about the Elizabeth Quay. Planned 440 million became 2.6 billion. Tremendous. And the Perth Stadium, 700 million, became 1.6 billion. And that broke the bank? And $10 billion won't? So we need new thinking. Status quo is our enemy. You've heard me saying that again and again and again. The way it has always been done. They've got the old guards protecting the civil servants, fiercely protecting them, keeping safe. Nothing new. No progress. And you've heard me often speak about the hemp, or the benefits as a building material, the potential for great profit. So, do we actually have profit there? And what's stopping it? Well, the only reason I can see why hemp is being stopped is because of the concerns for THC. Now, did I mention status quo thinking? I may be boring you just now, but what is the source of that fear? Well, first of all, international laws describe THC as a narcotic. Now, that is a lie. I'll state this boldly. This concept that THC is a narcotic, cannabis is a narcotic, is a bold-faced lie. And yet international laws describe it as such. In fact, a patient just the other week there, I was asking, can I take my medical cannabis with me when I go on a business trip to America? No, you can't, because as a narcotic, you get arrested at the border when you go in, even though 24 states have allowed cannabis. So a narcotic. And because of that, international law, the national laws have been defined as a narcotic. And because of that, the state laws define this as a narcotic, and the laws are crafted to treat THC as a narcotic. So all of our laws are basically based on a lie. Are we cool with that? It's not. Well, let's look at the dangers, the potential dangers. And let's see what dangers are. Because of the fear of THC, we've got restrictions that stop us using hemp. Even industrial hemp, 1% we're recognising, 1.1%. I heard this just yesterday, 1.1%, and the crop had to be destroyed because it was over the border of 1%. 1.1% have to destroy the crop. So huge barriers for growers and cultivators and users. Now, what about the revenue? The revenue I have calculated at around about, I'll start at the beginning. The last year's economic report stated, over the 4-year forward estimates, legalising recreational cannabis, just recreational cannabis, would need $1.25 billion, about 5% of the total value. If I do an estimate here for hemp based on those figures, looking at Australia as having around about $66 billion worth of our cannabis market annually, the 20% tax rate here, we'd have a revenue of about $14 billion in Western Australia. $14 billion. That's about 7 hospitals a year, or about 1 Metronet. Okay? But we're not making use of that because we're frightened of THC. What is the fear? 1, that THC causes psychosis. It doesn't. At least if it does, it's an awful lot less than tobacco and even smaller than alcohol. It does not. You could say, if you do it in combination with the dexamphetamine of, say, ADHD, yes, you've got a higher risk. But that's because it's prescribed by doctors who know what they're doing. Don't do that when you're giving dexamphetamine. So it's less dangerous than tobacco when it comes to psychosis. THC is addictive. No, it is not. It can be habituating, but then so can not banging your head against a brick wall, not getting a headache. THC kills. I did a worldwide search for deaths due to THC. 0. It's possible using cannabis with other drugs, there may be deaths there as well, but that's due to other drugs, not to the cannabis itself. And so far, I've discovered only 12 such cases. THC may be positive in meat derived from animals that have consumed industrial hemp. I've done the calculations, members, because I couldn't find the calculations here and DPIRD wouldn't tell me. That's true. THC can be positive in meat. On calculation, it appears that to get 1 episode of a medical dose of THC, one would have to eat 300 kilograms of beef in one sitting. It's about $6,000 for 1 medical dose of THC. And for that, we're concerned about giving hemp to animals. We can eat the seeds, okay, the animals can't because it might give THC. Wow. Then they say you can get increased THC in stressing times of growth. The recent high temperatures had caused some of the crop to develop THC as a defense. That's true. Where's the actual problem? If it's got THC there, people may use that and smoke it. And what's the problem? Unless you want to continue prohibiting a plant that is worldwide recognized as a healthy healing herb and used commonly as a homegrown remedy. Okay? And also, by the way, you're making police officers, you'd be diverting them from real work, that's just policing the roads. On my daily drive, when I'm working in the clinic, from Fremantle to Serpentine, the amount of crime I see on the roads, of poor driving, dangerous driving, is enormous. But no police. Where are they? We're lacking police because they're being employed elsewhere and doing things which chasing vapes, for example, chasing cannabis. And what will we as a state do with $14 billion revenue extra? Would we fund more child health care? Allow for a basic universal income? Could we build, as I said, 7 hospitals or 1 Metronet? Could we provide for adequate funding for the weakest in society? Would that not be just a wonderful thing to do? Maybe increase the wages for our public services, the nurses, the police, the teachers, the social services? Why are we depriving ourselves based on non-existent fears? So I never understood why government isn't grasping the potential of hemp as a building product, as an innovative product. The things we can make from that. We can even turn sunlight into electricity. We can use the hemp to make batteries. They're even making a bomb and bulletproof protection for the ADF motors using a combination of hemp and carbon fibre. Bomb-proof. Are we depriving ourselves of a very useful substance which has a potential for innovative changes right through our society? Of course we are. We need to have out-of-the-box thinking, and this state is simply not giving out-of-the-box thinking. We need to lead the way in sustainability, and we're not. We need to get people into warm, comfortable homes rather than leaving them to sleep on the streets. Oh dear. There's so many things I could say about this. There's huge demand for this, but we're not permitting it to happen because we're frightened. We're frightened of THC. I'm aware of the time and how we need to be wary of the coming legislation we're discussing, but climate, action and environment, a subject very dear to my heart. I've been involved in this since the 1980s. Net zero emissions 2050. Does anyone think this is acceptable? It may be something which is doable, but is it acceptable? This last year, we've seen, is it acceptable? Even now, in the US just now, they're experiencing temperatures which are far above normal. The sea warming, the potential there for the change in the North Atlantic gyrus. So we know it's not fast enough. In fact, the Paris Agreement, there's not one single country signed up to that has actually maintained the goals. Not one. We should maybe start. But deferring it, 2030, we can't do that, 2050. Why? Are we really not putting enough effort into that? Let me tell you. I spoke with someone who had very good experience in this, looking here at the economy of the wartime years. That man stated that during the war years, the innovation that people developed in response to the threats that the enemy posed resulted in magnificent changes, alterations, improvements. After the war, those different companies amalgamated into 1 or 2 larger companies. The rate of innovation sank to 10% of previous. There simply wasn't the drive. At the moment now, we need to develop a wartime mentality. No one cares. Was it man-made or was it natural? The fact is we have climate change. And we need to adapt to that, or as Twiggy Forrest mentioned just in a lecture last year, people will die. 3.5 billion people will die due to the effect of heat and humidity. Can we stand back without action? We cannot. Shall we take action now? Yes, we must. Are we? So far, very little. We've got vested financial interests. We've got the status quo thinking that's being defended. And I'm pessimistic that people will actually take this seriously. The sea rise is happening. Even now, we're seeing nations are moving people from their island homes. And even now, here in Perth, our leafy suburbs are going to be suffering this. Down at the river's edge in Perth, we're going to find people in the not-too-distant future having to sell their multi-million-dollar homes because they are no longer fit for living in because of sea rise. We need to adapt. We need to plan now. We need to get into the wartime mentality of dealing with an enemy, not as a war against, which is a negative thing, but a war for, changing things, discovering ways of doing what previously was thought to be unthinkable. If we don't do that, then our children are going to be left with a world which is less well off than it is just now. And whatever we're doing now, it just isn't sufficient. Let's flag this for all parts of government as an essential activity. Let's flag it as essential. It is essential. We cannot justify it to our children not to do so. I challenge you to rise to the challenge of meeting the needs of our next generation and the generation thereafter by taking action now. It's critical for our advancement. Perhaps what we should do is let business lead the way, because there is great profit to be made in this. Think, for example, about those who are making, say, the bomb and bulletproof motors. That's something you could sell. Now, in something less violent, there's plenty of other opportunities. What about creating materials which would go into space with the Australian space programme? That would be a fantastic idea for innovation. Shall we not make use of the opportunities which are in front of us to develop? Shall we not give this challenge to business? Let's focus on a new area of development. Let's let this flourish and let our nation flourish. This is what we should be doing as legislators. I've spoken again about the international issues. I'm not going to speak about them now because I've taken too much of your time, I would believe, except to say that I still have huge concerns as a nation and I appreciate this is actually a federal one, not actually a state one here, but why are we allowing, without protest, $400 billion to be spent on 8 submarines, costing about $4.2 billion each on average? So we're spending $50 billion per submarine, supporting a military-industrial complex of the US and the UK to get, by the time they're delivered, out-of-date submarines. When we have people here who are suffering homelessness, people who are suffering lack of schooling, people who are suffering unable to afford clothes to go to school, people who are unable to manage with their limited health constraints, managing the chronic health disease care of people who are suffering. We're not looking after the weakest in society as well as we might do, but we're quite happy to give a substantial sum to industrial complexes with which we actually have little benefit, apart from 8 out-of-date submarines and, of course, the infrastructure there of the military, the Navy, being able to say, we've got a way of looking out for the Chinese submarines. Do you think the Chinese are not advancing? Are they not developing things? Are they not moving forward at this very moment? Will they not find a way of detecting these submarines and actually removing them? 8. We are chucking our money away at things which don't matter to our people. And I personally, as a citizen of this country, resent that. And I will not have left this debate without having expressed that very clearly. And with these few words, I will resume my seat.